The coolest guy on the planet agrees to go on a cross-country run to haul hundreds of cases of bootleg beer to a rich Texan for a big party. I remember my dad talking about this movie when I was a kid, and for some reason I was convinced that when he described the plot to me, he was talking about something that him and his friends actually did before I was born. I thought he was the truck driver and Burt Reynolds was the real-life bandit who I also thought was my dad's close personal friend. Of course, none of that is true. Now, Smokey and the Bandit has had a cultural impact that has lasted over 40 years, most famously through Norm Macdonald and his perfect recreation of Burt Reynolds' Bandit character on Celebrity Jeopardy on Saturday Night Live. I've also heard stories that for years after this movie came out, CB radios shot up in popularity, and a lot of regular people were installing them on their cars and learning to speak that trucker lingo made famous by this film. My favorite lingo that I didn't already know was choke and puke, which is what they call a hole-in-the-wall greasy spoon restaurant along the highway. I'm adding Smokey and the Bandit to my Mount Rushmore of movies featuring CB radios alongside, well, really just one other movie, Joyride, starring Paul Walker and Steve Zahn. I wasn't around in the 1970s, but I cannot imagine a movie oozing late 70s charisma more than Smokey and the Bandit. Burt Reynolds had his heartthrob mustache and always had a smirk on his face while he's chewing on gum or whatever it is and making sexual innuendo jokes. The soundtrack, which was performed by truck driver Snowman Jerry Reed, who is one of the all-time great guitarists and just doesn't get enough credit. Seriously, do yourself a favor, look up some YouTube videos of Jerry Reed on the guitar. The dude is a beast. As far as the soundtrack goes, Westbound and Down is an all-time banger that has been stuck in my head since I watched this movie. There's a Nintendo 64 game that came out in the late 90s called Blast Corps, and me and my friends played it for hours and hours. And the soundtrack to Blast Corps reminds me a lot of the soundtrack to Smokey and the Bandit. I don't know if the two are at all related, but they just have that same kind of vibe to them. Now, there's never any risk that Snowman and Bandit aren't going to get away with their bootleg run because they are always several steps ahead of the angry sheriff portrayed by Honeymooners star Jackie Gleason. Gleason's character is so over the top and angry and full of dozens and dozens of classic one-liners. Every character in this movie has a code name that they use on the CB radio, and by the time the shine of this movie wore off, Top Gun came out and the code names were back again. First we had Bandit, Snowman, and Smokey, and those were replaced with Maverick, Goose, and Iceman. Now, a movie needs a leading lady, and Sally Field is that lady, but the way she is introduced into the movie is more unbelievable than just about anything else in the movie. Now, either way, she is a wonderful addition to the cast, and her and Burt Reynolds play really well off of each other, and a little research told me that they were a real-life couple at the time of this movie, so that probably explains the chemistry. As a kid, my favorite TV show was Dukes of Hazzard, and I assumed Smokey and the Bandit took inspiration from that show. But it turns out Smokey and the Bandit came first, so I guess Dukes of Hazzard took inspiration from Smokey and the Bandit. Now, when I said Dukes of Hazzard was my favorite show, I mean it. I used to make people call me Bo Duke, and when my little brother was born, I begged my parents to name him Luke so we could be Bo and Luke Duke. And you know what? They did. My brother is named after Luke Duke from the Dukes of Hazzard. Also, as a side note, I named my dad's truck Uncle Jesse around the same time, so there were a lot of Dukes of Hazzard references around our house in the early 1980s. Anyway, Smokey and the Bandit is just a lot of fun. All of the characters are having the time of their life, and every time Smokey Bear and his not-so-bright son wreck their police car again, you can't help but smile. I'm convinced that John Hughes' classic Planes, Trains, and Automobiles car was inspired by the police car in Smokey and the Bandit. The jokes are all obvious and contain so many sexual innuendos, but they're just good, harmless fun. If the language ever got too hot to handle, the characters would either abbreviate their swears by saying F-O instead of telling someone to or, as someone would cuss, a conveniently placed truck horn would drown out the sound. This is a cross-country road trip movie, but it sure didn't feel like I was seeing the country while I watched it. Even though the movie takes place across multiple states, I'm pretty sure it was probably all filmed in about a 2-mile radius because all the scenery looked the same throughout. And this doesn't bother me, it just adds to the charm of the movie. Now, I'm sad I didn't see this movie until 45 years after it came out. It's a low-stakes, amusing time capsule of a movie, and I'm looking forward to watching it again. Maybe with my brother, where I can tell him how lucky he is I didn't ask our parents to name him Smokey, Snowman, Bandit, or Little Beaver. Driving with a girl in your lap, floppy-eared basset hounds, guitar legends driving 18-wheelers, matching suits, police officers with pencil-thin mustaches, talking on a CB radio.